Hi, this is Tennille Jancola, and this is my case study for EDL 851, A Good Teacher Turns Bad. What do we know? We know that this situation took place at Crestview Elementary, which is located in a rural area. It is one of 3 elementary schools, and the faculty has 18 teachers, a media specialist, a counselor, 2 special education teachers, and 3 aides. Mrs. Wilson is the principal. She is in her 3rd year at this time of being the principal at this school. The school is in good shape. It has attendance is good, test scores are above average, and parents are very well pleased with the school overall. We know that Mrs. Horton is a first grade teacher. She is a former first teacher of the year. She is a seasoned professional. However, at the end of last school year, she became very stressed, less friendly, and argumentative with her colleagues, and really just kind of defensive and gets upset a lot when things just aren't going her way or people aren't agreeing with her. It was discovered by Mrs. Wilson that Mrs. Horton's husband had moved out, and she was now a single mom of 2 teenage boys. We also know that within 6 weeks at the beginning of this school year, Mrs. Wilson has already began to receive phone calls and letters from parents about Mrs. Horton. They are reporting that she is verbally abusive, she is screaming at students, she has been late to school, she refuses to hold parent-teacher conferences, even though Mrs. Wilson has affirmed that what she has seen and observing the teacher in the classroom is not what the parents are seeing. This does not please them. They are adamant that there is something going on in the classroom. Mrs. Wilson then receives a phone call from the superintendent saying that 4 parents have contacted school board members and wanting their child to be removed from Mrs. Horton's classroom. And so Mrs. Wilson promises that she is going to investigate further and get to the bottom of what is going on. We also know that Mr. Stafford, a father of one of the students in Mrs. Horton's class, insists on seeing Mrs. Wilson. He came in and demanded that his daughter be removed from her classroom immediately. Says that Mrs. Horton has ignored phone calls, has ignored letters, will not meet with the parents, will not set up a parent-teacher conference and meet with them, and reports that his daughter has a lot of anxiety, is very anxious, is not eating like she used to, and is no longer sleeping at night. Mrs. Wilson decides to hold a meeting with Mr. Stafford and Mrs. Horton, and when they come in and visit, Mr. Stafford begins to visit and discuss what he sees is going on and from what his daughter is saying. And Mrs. Horton immediately attacks him and says that he calls him a liar, tells him everything he is saying is lies. And so Mrs. Wilson ends the conference right away and tells Mr. Stafford she will get back to him and turns to address Mrs. Horton. What do we need to know? First of all, we need to know, what is Mrs. Horton's classroom actually like? What is the environment like? How many students are in the classroom? How was she towards her colleagues in years past? Have the relationships been well and now all of a sudden they're bad, or has there been some rocky situations before? Why is Mrs. Wilson's perception of what is going on in Mrs. Horton's class so different from what the parents are reporting? How has Mrs. Horton been viewed in the past by parents? Has she always been well liked, or has there been some issues before this? What do her students say about her in her classroom? Are they, what is their true perception of what is going on? And are the majority of the parents upset with Mrs. Horton, or just these 4 families? Have more parents contacted her that we don't know about? Have they contacted the superintendent, or is it just these 4? And are these 4 families that in the past, have they had issues with the school before, or is this something brand new? My plan of action would be first to review Mrs. Horton's past evaluations to see if there are anything in her evaluations that have come up before about issues like this or anything of that nature. I would definitely conference with her immediately, letting her know first and foremost that we are there to support her, give her the assistance that she needs, maybe time off, provide a substitute if necessary so she can take care of her emotional well-being, and also just to get her perspective of what's going on in her classroom. Have the parents really been contacting her? Does she get the notes? Does she, those types of things. I would definitely observe Mrs. Horton in the classroom by more frequent and more regular walkthroughs and observations. And I would take note of the environment. I would take note of the students, how they're responding to her, how they're not responding to her, and of Mrs. Horton's demeanor, how she's being. Is it, Sometimes I know when you go into a classroom, teachers put on their best and when you're in there. So maybe even just kind of stand outside her door at times just to listen to see also, is this truly what's going on? And get a full grasp of her classroom environment. Depending upon the negotiated agreement and evidence and data gathered, I would also set up a plan for Mrs. Horton, something that we could get started so that we can get her back to where we need her as a teacher and to help her with whatever is going on. I would make sure to document all incidents, phone calls, letters, observations, everything that I am noticing, everything that I'm hearing, anything that comes to me personally and across my desk. I would definitely meet with the parents that called the school board members, get their input about the classroom, get all of their um, data and get all of what their perceptions and what their students or how they're getting their knowledge and what is going on. I would compare the parents' perspective to my own observations of the classroom and try to see if there is still a discrepancy or what is going on. Collaborate with all stakeholders involved to gain insight to develop a plan as well, and to follow up with Mrs. Horton to discuss the plan, to let her know that there is a need and we need to take care of it. To resolve the issues based on promoting the success of all students, I would first ensure a safe environment for all the students and staff. I would visit classrooms regularly, not just Mrs. Horton's, but all classrooms, and visit with the teachers, ask them how the relationship is going with Mrs. Horton. Is there anything else that I need to be aware of? And I would met with all the teachers, not just, as I said, Mrs. Horton. And I'd also look at students, how they're handling things when Mrs. Horton is around or different, and things of that nature. I would help Mrs. Horton deal with her emotional stress. I would definitely provide resources for her, time off, provide a substitute, allow for whatever she needed so that we could get her back to the full capacity of being the teacher we need her to be in the classroom. And I would provide a set time to meet with Mrs. Horton regularly to discuss the current situation. In going through the problem and debriefing it, I was thinking, Mrs. Horton has had a traumatic event take place. And I was kind of trying to put myself in her shoes. How would I handle the situation? What are some things that I would do? I was also feeling that thinking that Mrs. Horton is not emotionally able to teach. So we need to do something to get that back into perspective. We need to get her some help. I was thinking that Mrs. Wilson has to get on top of this situation quickly. She has to get it resolved. This cannot draw out any longer. We have a classroom of students who are 6 and 7 years old, and they are taking the brunt of some pretty big issues. And I was thinking the parents are not only hurt, they are lost, they are angry, and they are unsure of what to do. I was at the same time feeling compassion for Mrs. Horton. Being married myself, I can only imagine what she's going through. And I was feeling we really need to get her some help. We need to take care of her first. I was also feeling compassion for Mrs. Wilson because this is a huge issue to deal with, especially in your third year. You're still kind of new at the job, and Mrs. Horton possibly could have been a colleague at one time before also. And so to have this is kind of a touchy situation. I was feeling compassion for her. I'm feeling very concerned for Mrs. Horton's students. They are only 6 to 7 years old and having to deal with a teacher who is irrational. One of the adults in their lives they're supposed to trust, to look up to, and there is no trust. They're having to deal with that. And I was also concerned for the relationships between Mrs. Horton and her colleagues. There's a lot of damage taking place, and that's going to be hard to repair. And that concerns me because we need our colleagues in order to be successful as well. And definitely feeling empathy for the parents. I'm valuing, though, Mrs. Wilson's insight that she knows this needs to get taken care of. She begins to investigate. She's getting on top of it. She's trying to do what she can. I'm valuing Mrs. Wilson's concern for Mrs. Horton also. She realizes that she needs to help her and get her back to where she needs to be. I'm valuing the parents for advocating for their children, not letting this just go by with, oh, that's, so sad. She's had this traumatic thing. We'll just make it through the year. I'm valuing that they're advocating for their child. And I'm also valuing the students who have to endure what is going on every day as such young kids. Issues that I feel could still be unresolved. Mrs. Horton's emotional state. Has she dealt with what's happening? Is she getting herself some counseling? Is she getting herself some help? Mrs. Horton's relationships with her colleagues, will they be salvaged? Will respect and trust be regained? Will there be something that can good that can come out of this? Mrs. Horton's classroom environment, will she be able to follow the plan set in place? Will she be cooperative of that plan? Will she recognize that there needs to be a plan? And will she be able to stop lashing out at her students and taking personal issues out on them? The issue of parents wanting the child out of Mrs. Horton's classroom, will they trust in the plan that the school has developed, that I have developed? Will they be able to follow it? Will they cooperate and let the plan be able to work? And are they being regularly communicated with and kept abreast of what is going on and what the school is doing? In promoting the academic success and personal well-being of every student, I believe that I have done that by ensuring that my staff and students were in a safe environment. I visited classrooms regularly and more frequently. I took note of what I observed. I met with all the teachers more frequently to get a feel of what they were feeling and how they felt things were going and what they were noticing. I ensured that Mrs. Horton's students were safe. I visited her classroom frequently, more than like 2 to 3 times a week. I made sure to take note of what was observed in both the students and in Mrs. Horton. I developed a plan for Mrs. Horton to follow based on observations, and I communicated that plan with her and how the situation was going to be handled. And I communicated regularly with the parents. I made sure they were feeling heard and valued in the situation at hand and began to rebuild the trust between the school and those parents. And I made sure that Mrs. Horton was receiving the help she needed. I allowed for time off and provided a substitute if needed, and I stayed in constant communication with her, making sure that we were doing everything we could to support her. And I set up times to meet with Mrs. Horton on a regular basis, just to make sure that we were all on the same page, that the plan was being followed, that she was working on her emotional well-being, and that the students were of utmost priority by putting all of these things in place. I thank you for taking the time to look at my case study. Have a good day.